Hey everybody, welcome back. I want to talk about another question that we oftentimes get, and that is property management. What are property management fees? And we try to keep them uniform across our portfolio, operating in two different markets right now. I did have an exciting call with another builder this morning in a new market that will potentially be rolling out, so we'll keep an eye on that, leaving you hanging in suspense, of course. But management is decided on the local level. Right. There is no uniform management fee that is charged across the United States of America. Usually what you're going to see is management fees on residential properties are anywhere from probably 5 on the very lowest end. You probably have a lot of properties being managed with that manager, up to 10%, right? And like I said, it definitely depends on negotiating with the manager, but all markets kind of have a standard that they adhere to. And so you've got that range in fees that you have to consider, but then you also have to consider other fees, predominantly lease-up fees, right? I've noticed in the Western U.S., lease-up fees are pretty low. When you get into the Midwest and the South, and even Texas, a lot of times managers want to take a full month's rent for that initial lease-up fee. And people fight that all the time. And the managers fight back on that all the time. There's just a cost of doing business, and you have to make sure that it's reflected in your calculations. And really, it's that turnover that kills you, right? If the property is turning over all the time and they're charging you a month, right? Are they, people wonder sometimes, is the manager incentivized to let tenants move out so they can go get a big leasing commission on this property? I don't think so. I mean, the work that goes into that, and I know from our management company perspective, we would rather have all the properties leased all the time and not have to go through the work of turning these units over and finding new tenants. We'd rather just collect the management fee and deal with that along the way. I can't speak for everybody, but having kind of seen behind the curtain, we would much rather do that. So I get asked, well, what are the Peak Group's management fees? And typically you're going to range between 8 and 10% based on how many properties that you have under management. Typically you're going to have about a half a month's rent, sometimes a full month's rent based on how many you have under management. And we'll go over that with you if you reach out to us to talk about properties. I'm going to have Bryce Gilbert, our director of property management, on an episode here in a couple of weeks where we can really get into the details of what's happening in the markets and what fees look like and what the typical call with an owner looks like. Most of the time on my properties, I spend 5 minutes a month working on those properties because I'll get a notice of, here's your statement, here's what your expenses were for the month. We had to spend $75 on repairs. There was this, that, and the other. I look at that, I match it up against my bank statement and did the rents hit or not. And that's about the size of it. It doesn't take too much time. But occasionally we need to get aggressive on some marketing, or occasionally there's a little bit of a drama with a tenant and I've got to exchange some messages or even have a call with the property manager on that. So I think, owning residential properties, plan on 5 to 10 minutes a month, but that's why you pay them. You've got better things to do with your time than worry about that. So that's how the fees work with the Peak Group. Some people try to self-manage, and I'll tell you this, in many of our build-to-rent communities, we don't allow it. And it's been a deal breaker for some people. Many of our build-to-rent communities, we have a restriction that you've got to use our property management. Part of that is, maybe we're greedy capitalists. I don't know. But it does make our life, and I can promise you, your life easier if there is one property manager. I just did a video about HOA, how, it's kind of, you got to have one sheriff in town. The HOA is responsible for the outside of the community, outside of the buildings. The property manager is what's the inside of the buildings, the tenant qualifications. Are they paying or are they not? And when you're advertising for tenants, and there are 7 different property managers in that community, right? If it's not handled well, it can sometimes become a race to the bottom because everybody is competing with one another. But if one manager is there, they can control that marketing, they control the public perception of the properties and what's available, and they can keep those rents more elevated where they need to be so that you can maximize your return on an investment. I've learned some hard lessons on this one over the years, having done a lot of build for rent communities and had a central role in many of those. And I can kind of explain to you the evolution of how that happened for us. Initially it was, let's build these 200 townhomes. Investors are going to own each of them differently. And, let's just, the market is the market. Let's let them use their own property managers. Didn't work great, right? You end up meeting a lot of spats between managers, especially because they have to interface with the HOA. It just gets messy. I can certainly understand an investor's desire to have their own property manager, right? They have somebody they trust that they want to work with. And so, like somebody that wants to use their own, sometimes it's been a deal breaker for us and vice versa. And so we went to that restriction where we would put one property manager in the CC&Rs for the HOA. CC&R standing for codes, covenants, and restrictions. Those are the rules that are recorded on title that people have to abide by that give the HOA teeth. After doing that for a while, I learned, man, if there is something that investors hate more than a race to the bottom because there are too many property managers, it's not being able to move property managers when they're not happy with the one they have, right? When they feel like they're forced to have this person that isn't doing a good job for them. You could also make the case that impacts your liquidity down the line, right? Because if you bought a fourplex or something and you want to sell it 5 years later, you list that on the open market. We'd love to do it for you. That's a big part of our business, but in theory, you could call up any old agent to do it. Those new investors are going to come in and some of them are going to have their own property manager that they want to use. And so it's not a perfect solution, but to date, after thousands of doors of testing, the best solution we've been able to come up with is to restrict to our property manager for the first 2 years. Because what happens in that first 2 years, you need extra control over it. Oftentimes, builders can turn over, and when I say that, they mean they finish, say, 30 new units at a time, and they turn it over to the property manager for leasing. Sometimes when that happens, in spite of everybody's best efforts, it's not a great time to turn over 30 units. The opposite can be true as well, but sometimes it's December 20th. And because of the weather, the landscaping isn't in. The sidewalks might be in, but the yards are muddy. The amenities are not in yet. It's just not a great time to lease. And you got overwhelmed with a bunch of supply at the same time. That is a recipe for disaster when there are 7 different property managers. When there's one property manager, they can typically make the best of it. They can control the advertising, the incentives, and get everybody the maximum amount of rent possible. And generally, when we do it that way, I call it like a modified round robin, where the first unit that was completed, right, that's investor Bob. The first tenant that comes in the door goes into that unit. The second is the second. The third is the third. And if this is fourplexes or duplexes, the first one goes to Bob, the second one to Fred, and as soon as everybody has one tenant, they come back around until everybody is full. That's the hardest part of it. And it doesn't always go perfectly that way. Sometimes the tenant says, well, I want that one instead. That's why I call it a modified round robin. It's not completely perfect how it works. So that's a good way to get through it. And then once 2 years have gone by and the community is stable, we're running at 90 to 95% occupancy. We start to get into a situation where the market rents just are what they are. It's much more difficult to have a race to the bottom. I have seen it, but it's much more difficult to have that because there's 2 years of history of leasing on the MLS and with the managers. And if people want to bring in a new one at that point, it makes a little bit more sense. And so the best approach we found so far is, restrict it for 2 years and then open it up after that. At that point, because now we have a stable market. So those are just some general thoughts on property management and how it works on the build to rent level and some tough lessons we've learned over the years. We are always looking for better solutions and upgrading how those things are handled, and we'll certainly implement those as the data come in. But right now, that's the best we've got, and we hope it's helpful for you. Thanks.